Good morning, Rabbi.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We are
Morning, Rabbi.
continuing the review of the second chapter of Tractate Megillah, and we are holding 18b, about halfway down the page, Tanu Rabbanon. So, the Gemara says as follows, Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught in the Brisa, Hishmit ba Sefer Oisios Epsukin. So, you had a scribe who wrote out a Megillah, and the Megillah was written in such a way that there were a few words missing, or there were a few verses missing. So what can the guy who has this Megillah, the unfortunate owner of this Megillah, what is he supposed to do if he comes Purim and he realizes he's in the middle of reading and there's words missing? So he says what we should do is we read it by heart, just like the translator in the time when they used to read from the Torah and somebody used to translate, the translator would say it by heart. He wouldn't read it from inside the scroll. And the reason why is because no one should ever think that there's Targum in the Torah itself, right? The Targum is a translation. So he would read it by heart. So too, if you're reading the Megillah and you realize that there's words missing, then you read it by heart. Now, we raised an objection to this particular brisa that we just mentioned, because here it seems to be saying that if you have some letters missing or there's something wrong with parts of the Megillah, that you can still read from it and you fulfill your obligation. But there's another brisa that says that if the letters in the Megillah were partially effaced or torn, then it says if their impression is recognizable, right, then it's valid. But if not, it's not valid. So now that seems to be directly contradicting what we've said, because we said even if it's completely missing, it's still fine. And here it's saying, well, only if it's still recognizable, but if there's something, completely missing, right, if it's completely effaced or it's torn, then it's not kosher. So how are you going to resolve it? So the Gemara resolves it by saying, we're talking about two different cases. Our case, the first brisa that we brought down, is talking about the scenario where it's only a few words, only a few lines missing. However, the second brisa that you just quoted is talking about when the majority, if not all of it, has the problem of it being unrecognizable or torn. In which case, when most of the Megillah is missing words or it's rubbed out in a way that's not recognizable, then in that case the Megillah will be possible. In other words, it's not impossible to invalidate a Megillah. It can be invalidated if the majority of it is, or if all of it is going to be problematic. You can't recognize the letters, or it's rubbed out or torn. Okay, now we're going to talk about a case of reading the Megillah out of sequence, right? The Mishnah, the Gemara cites the brisa. It says that what happens if the reader omitted one verse, then he cannot continue reading and say, you know what? After I finish reading the whole thing, then I'll go back and read the verse that I missed. It doesn't work that way. Although you do not have to start again from the beginning, you do have to go back to the place that you skipped from and read from there. So let's say you start off from the beginning of the Megillah, and you get towards the end of the first chapter, and you skip a verse, and you continue with the second chapter. And then halfway through the second chapter, you realize, oh no, I just realized I didn't read the last verse of the first chapter. What you have to do is you go back to the last verse of the first chapter and you continue reading from there. You read that verse again, or well, you're reading it for the first time because you missed it. You read from there and then you keep going. You cannot say, I'll just finish off and read it later. No, it doesn't work that way. And then this happens quite often, where somebody walks in, they're told that the Megillah reading is going to start at this and this time. They get stuck in traffic. They walk in and the guy's already started. The guy reading the Megillah has already started and he's halfway through. So the guy says, you know what I'll do? I'm going to save time. I'm going to listen to the second half now. And I know they're doing another reading at the top of the hour, right? So what I'll do is I'll listen to the first half after the second half. And then halfway through, I'll go home, right? Because then I've heard the whole thing. I've heard the second half and then the first half. That doesn't work. That's not okay, right? What you have to do is you have to hear the whole Megillah from the beginning until the end. That's just the way it is. Okay. Now, as we pointed out later on in the Gemara, right? towards the end of the tractate, it says that it seems to give us the impression, and that is the halacha, that if you read the Torah out of order, right, it's still kosher. At least with the Eved, your Yotze, if you read a section of the Torah, missed the verse, and you go back and read that verse afterwards. Okay, but with the Megillah, that's not okay. With the Megillah, that doesn't work. Okay, so now we'll continue to quote from the Mishnah, where the Mishnah had said to us that if somebody is half asleep, right, but he was reading it while he's half asleep, then he still fulfilled his obligation. But the question is, what does this word misnamning mean? What does it mean, half asleep? So the Gemara clarifies and says that what it means is the guy is awake but not fully awake, is asleep but not fully asleep. In other words, if you call him, he'll respond. But if you ask him a question that requires, reasoning and logic, he won't be able to give you a cogent response. So therefore, he's awake, so he'll answer to you calling, but he's not able to answer properly to any questions that you ask. Now the Gemara proceeds to the next clause of the Mishnah, which says that if one was writing Megillah, or expounding on the Megillah, or correcting the Megillah, but obviously we're talking about in the process, he's saying every word of the Megillah, if he had in mind that while I'm doing this, I'm also fulfilling the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, then he's fulfilled his obligation. So the Gemara asks, what's going on over here, right? How could you have somebody who's either expounding or editing or copying a Megillah, right, or writing a Megillah, right, that he could fulfill his obligation by saying all the words? If he first arranged each verse in his mind, and then, right, meaning in his mind, he's thinking, what do I need to write? He knows the Megillah by heart. So he's thinking, okay, I have to write Vayihi b'Achashverosh, Hu Achashverosh, and so on. And then he sits down and he writes it. What does it help me that he had in mind while he's saying it, right? That how could you say he's fulfilled his obligation? What he's just done right now is he said the whole thing back from memory, right? So rather, what are you going to say? You're going to say that the case must be talking about where the guy wrote down each verse and then he read it, okay? In other words, one way you could think of it happening is a guy says, Vayihi b'Achashverosh, Hu Achashverosh, and then he writes down those words. Then he says the next verse, and he writes down those words. The Gemara says that can't be the case, obviously, because then all he's doing is he's saying it by heart. He's not reading from a Megillah. So what do we have to say is he writes down Vayihi b'Achashverosh, Hu Achashverosh, and then he reads it from what he just wrote. That must be the case, what we're speaking about in the Mishnah, where it says that if he had in mind, while he was writing or editing the Megillah, then he fulfills his obligation. But then the Gemara says that too isn't a good answer, because has he really fulfilled his obligation? We've heard from Rav Chelbait, right, in the name of Rav Chama Bar Guria, who said in the name of Rav that the halacha goes according to the one who says that you have to read the entire Megillah, right? Now, what's this referring to? A bit further on here in the Gemara, we'll get to it today, there's a discussion about where you start reading from the Megillah from. Do you start reading it from the beginning? Do you start from chapter 2? Do you start from chapter 6? Where do you start? Do you start from chapter 3? Where do you start reading the Megillah from? So he says that even according to the person who says that you start in chapter 2 from Ish Yehudi, right? Nevertheless, he's also in agreement that when you read it, you have to read it from a Megillah that's written in its entirety. So therefore, we still have a problem. You tried to respond to the challenge that we had about how could you have somebody saying it and then fulfilling their obligation as he's writing it. That doesn't work because he's reading it by heart. So then you're telling me, no, he didn't say it by heart and then write it. Rather, he wrote it and then he read one verse at a time of what he wrote. That also doesn't work because you need to have the entire Megillah in front of you. You have to have a full Megillah written out in front of you so that it's a kosher Megillah, and that's the Megillah you have to read from. So how can the case of our Mishnah be talking? In other words, what case could it be talking of? So the Gemara answers that really what we have to say happened over here is that he had a complete Megillah in front of him, and he reads from it one verse at a time, and then he writes it. So in other words, he's not writing it by heart. He's got an existing kosher Megillah in front of him, and he's using that Megillah to copy from, and he's writing, and what he's doing is, the way he's writing this new Megillah is, he is saying one verse, and then he's writing it down. Now, you might think that because he's preoccupied with writing a Megillah, so he can also fulfill his mitzvah of reading the Megillah on Purim, because as we've established, when it comes to what you can do in terms of malacha on Purim, Purim is not forbidden. It's not forbidden to write. You're allowed to write on Purim. So therefore, somebody's writing the Megillah on Purim, and you might think that he cannot simultaneously fulfill his obligation to hear the Megillah reading by doing it at the same time as writing it. Comes along the Mishnah and says it's fine. Okay, in other words, that he has fulfilled his obligation. So now, once we've established that the case of our Mishnah is talking about where he already had a full Megillah in front of him from which he's copying, right? So perhaps we could say that this supports the teaching of Rabbi Baba Chana. What does Rabbi Baba Chana say in the name of Rabbi Yechanan? He says that it is forbidden for a person to write even one letter in the Torah if he doesn't copy from an existing text, which means to say, you have a sofer who wants to write a Sefer Torah. Just because he's an expert Baal Korah and an expert sofer and he knows the whole Torah by heart, that does not give him permission to write even one letter in this new Torah scroll that he wants to write by heart. He's got to first look in the text in front of him. He's got to have either a Torah scroll or what's called a Tikkun Sofrim, right, which is a special printed book that they have for Sofrim, which they are able to look into to have an accurate copying of the Torah. So maybe we could say, right, that our Mishnah, right, which we said is teaching about a case where the guy wrote a Megillah from a complete Megillah, is a support to this principle that you cannot write even one letter from the Sefer Torah without having the whole text in front of you. To which the Gemara says that this is not a good proof. And the reason is because maybe our Mishnah just happens to be talking about a case where a complete Megillah is in front of him. It's not that he has to write it in that manner. What does that mean? It means like this. Our Mishnah that we've quoted, right, is talking about the laws of how does one have to read the Megillah in order to be able to fulfill their obligation. And we've said it has to be in such a way that you have the whole text of the Megillah in front of you. Our Mishnah is not talking about what the rules are for writing the Megillah. It just happens to be that one of the ways you can fulfill your obligation of reading the Megillah is if you're writing another Megillah and you happen to have the whole Megillah in front of you from which you're copying. But it's not a proof to tell me that that's the only way you can write anything of scripture, that you have to have the text in front of you. It just happens to be that he had the text in front of him. So therefore, we reject this proof to try and support Rabbi Baba Chana's statement in the name of Rabbi Yechanan. Now, as the Gemara will often do, once we already mentioned this ruling from Rabbi Baba Chana in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, we say, why don't we unpackage that law itself? Why don't we take a close look at it? And that's what the word gufa means. The word gufa means let's go back to the actual text that you've just cited before and look at it. What does it say? Rabbi Baba Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yechanan that a person is not allowed to write even one letter if it's not copied from the text. This ruling is being challenged now from a story, right? There was a story with Reb Meir. Reb Meir was one time required to go to a place called Asya, which was outside of Eretz Yisrael, according to most, right? That this was a place outside of Eretz Yisrael, and the reason why he had to go is because he had to be involved in, establishing the calendar, whether there's going to be an extra month or not, in that year, and so in the month of Adar, right, meaning Purim time, he didn't have a Megillah with him, and he doesn't know what to do. What should he do? Well, not that he didn't know what to do. He had a problem, but he knew what to do. And what did he do? He went and he wrote a Megillah by heart, and then he read it. He read the Megillah by heart. He wrote it by heart, and he then went on to read it. Now, why did he do that? The reason why he did it is because, as we've said from our Mishnah, you cannot read it by heart. You've got to read it from a Megillah. So what he did was he wrote it by heart, but then read it inside. This seems to be contradicting the ruling of Rabbi Babachan and the name of Rabbi Yechanan. Because what did he say? He said that you can't even write one letter by heart. But here Meir wrote a whole Megillah. So what's going on? How can Rav's ruling, in other words, that which Rabbi Yechanan, that which Rabbi Babachana said in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, how could that be? How could that be correct in light of the story with Rabbi Meir? So Rabbi Abahu answers the question, and he says that Rabbi Meir was different because there's a particular pasuk which talks about special people, right? Who it says, and the pupils of your eyes shall look straight in front of you. And what that means to say is that it's talking about the words of Torah, of which it says, close your eyes from it and it is gone, right? So by Rabbi Meir, even though he didn't have the text in front of him, it was as if he was having his eyes wide open and looking right at the text, even though he didn't have a text in front of him. Meaning to say, he was so fluent in the Torah, he knew all the chaseris and yaseris, which means the words in the Torah that have extra letters or less letters. Sometimes you can spell out a word in full, or sometimes you can spell it incomplete. You know, sometimes the word Yerushalayim appears with the yud, sometimes it appears without a yud. Sometimes, the word atah can appear with aleph taf without the hay or with the hay, and likewise. In other words, you could have with a vav, without a vav. So he knew all of these different particulars of the Torah, and so he was so special because he was so fluent. He was permitted to write the Torah by heart, not Torah, but the Megillah by heart. So now the Gemara wants to challenge this and says, listen, Reb Meir is not the only genius in the time of the Gemara. There are other geniuses as well, right? There was a guy, right? So you have Reb Chisda, saw of Hananel writing books of the Torah by heart, not from a text. So Reb Chisda said to him, the entire Torah could be written from your memory, right? But what can you do? The rabbi said you're not allowed to write it by heart. So what we see over here, right, is a guy who, I don't know whether he was equal to Reb Meir, but he was a giant in his own rights, and he was somebody who was fluent in the Torah, and so much so that Reb Chisda says that we could rely on you to write the whole Torah, right, from memory. But what can you do? The rabbis don't allow it. So therefore, if that's the case, how is Reb Meir able to write the Megillah, even though we see clearly that this ruling of the Mishnah is something this ruling of Rabbi Yechanan is something that is upheld. So the Gemara says, right? The Gemara says that the case of Reb Meir was different, and the reason is because it was pressing. His need was to read the Megillah, and all he was able is his own Megillah from memory. Otherwise, he would not fulfill the obligation to read the Megillah the way you're supposed to read it. And in the Gilyanis Hashas, which is on the left-hand side of the page, it says that what Reb Meir actually did was he wrote it by heart. Okay, he wrote one Megillah by heart, and then, right, that Megillah he used to write another Megillah. Then he took the original Megillah that he wrote by heart and he put it into Geniza. He buried it. In other words, to say he put it as Shemus because he still, even though he was in a pressing moment where he didn't have any other choice, he still didn't want to use a Megillah that was written by heart. He only wanted to use a Megillah that was actually written copying another Megillah. So he wrote two Megillahs. Okay, that's an interesting observation from the Gilyanis Shas. Now, Abaya, he permitted the members of the house of Bara and mezuzahs by heart. Now, why? Why did he allow that? He allowed that because it seems that these portions that you write in the tefillin and in the mezuzahs are small portions, which Sofrim, right, scribes, are familiar with by heart. But the Gemara asks, who does Abaya's opinion follow? Who does he follow in terms of being able to give that exemption or that allowance to these scribes? So he says it accords with the following Tana, that it was taught in the Braisa, that Rabbi Yirmiyah says in the name of Rabbeinu, right? Tefillin and mezuzahs can be written without copying from a text, which means they can be written from memory, right? And another thing that there's a difference between the tefillin, right, and the Sefer Torah, for example, is that the tefillin do not have to be written with etched lines. So if Sefer Torah has etched lines which serve as guidelines for where to write letters, whereas the tefillin, you don't need to do those etched lines to write it. Whereas mezuzahs do, right? But it continues over there in the Braisa, and it says that both of them, the tefillin and the mezuzahs, they can both be written from memory. And what's the reason? The reason the Braisa says, the Gemara says, the reason is because the people are very fluent with their contents. Most people know Shema and V'hayim Shema by heart, and the Sofrim, the scribes, certainly know it by heart. That's the end of that shtickle Gemara. Any questions before we go any further? Or is it all clear? Okay. We're going to assume that it's all clear. We move on to the next quote from the Mishnah, which says that if a Megillah was written with a type of sam, which is like a type of dye, so it says that sam is called, in English, it's orpiment. Then you have sikra. What is sikra? He says that is it's the sap of a tree. Sikra is, I think, like a red dye, and then you have sikra, which is then you have kumos, which is sap of a tree. You have kankantim, which is a shoemaker's like black polish, and none of these things can be used to write a Megillah with. Diphthera. Now, diphthera.
I have a question.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. In that example you gave, where he's writing where he wrote the first Megillah by heart, and then he buried it in Geniza after he wrote a third Megillah based on this. No, he wrote a second Megillah based on that first Megillah.
Right.
First Megillah wasn't written properly. Is he allowed to copy that to write a kosher Megillah?
Yes, because the point here is that you're no longer relying just on memory. You're actually reading it from a text as you're copying. You know, it's one thing to rely on memory. It's another thing to rely on memory and a text. You know, if I'm trying to recall something and I have only my memory to rely on, right? I may recall it, but I'm not sure whether I recalled it correctly. If there's a text, right? If there's a text that I'm relying on as well, then I can be more confident inside myself that, yes, that's how I remember seeing it. You know, there are people who know the whole Shas by heart. They know the whole Talmud by heart. I've met such people, know the whole Talmud by heart. And when they are quoting from another place in the Talmud, they will tell you what page and how many lines down on the page, and whether they're big lines, small lines, or huge lines, right? The middle-sized lines or the long-side lines, and how many lines down. And it's unbelievable. Why? Because in their mind, not only do they remember the contents, they actually remember the image of what the page looks like, right? That's incredible, right? So if I'm writing a Megillah from memory, I may have a really good memory, yeah, but I'm relying only on my memory. But if I now have a text in front of me and my memory, when I look at the text, I say that's exactly how I remember seeing it in another Megillah. It's right there in front of me. And so therefore, although he didn't want to use the original Megillah that he wrote, although he didn't want to use that original Megillah that he wrote in order to fulfill the mitzvah, but nevertheless, he was of the opinion that it was a good enough text to copy and write this new Megillah on. That makes sense?
Rabbi Mordechai has a question.
Mordechai.
Yeah, the thing that you were just saying about people knowing the Shas by heart. I think I had heard about a case where there are people where if you open a particular Gemara and then take a pin and then stick the pin into the Gemara, they're able to tell what
right.
the words are, where the end of the pin is.
Right. So I heard that about Rabbi Hirschsprung from Montreal of blessed memory. I heard that he was somebody who was able to do that. Yeah, it's quite incredible. Okay, so going back to sorry, yeah.
There was they said that my Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Yaakov Koppel Goldberg, Rosh Hashiva of Hadar Torah, was Bucky B'Shas.
Wow.
I asked a question about how is it that this rabbi is having a conversation with this rabbi? According to this chart I have, they lived at different times. He went right over to the Shas, pulled down a Shas of a different Sefer, of a different Gemara, opened right to the page, and showed me that this was a different person by the same name.
Right. That's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Like always, Bucky B'Shas.
That's right. So moving on, we're talking about the parchment. It has to be written on. If it was written on something called diphthera, which is unfinished parchment, right? Which means, what does it mean? It means that it was salted and treated with flour and water, but it wasn't treated with gall nuts. So then that is not going to be considered proper parchment, and you cannot write on that. And niyar is papyrus. Okay, so now quoting from the Mishnah, in the last part of the Mishnah, it says that it has to be written in Hebrew, right? How do we know it has to be written in Hebrew? Because it's written. This is a Gezerah Shava. It's excuse me. It's written as they are written, and according to their time. So that was Hebrew, and it has to be written on parchment with black ink, right? And where do we know this from? That it has to be written on parchment and with ink, because we learn Gezerah Shava from the book of Yirmiyah, right? In the book of Yirmiyah, although you have to understand that when it comes to Gezerah Shava is usually used to derive a biblical command, not a rabbinic command. But we're using the same method and approach, even though this is a rabbinic enactment. So it's not a real Gezerah Shava, but it's like an asmachta. It's like a support. Now what? That it says over here that Esther Hamalka wrote, and it says over there in the book of Yirmiyahu that Baruch said to them from his mouth, he dictated to me all these words, and I wrote it on parchment. So since it says over in the Megillah Vatichtay, and it says in Yirmiyahu, Va'ani Kosev, right? So the ksiva, right? The both forms of the word ksiva, which is writing, that serves as a verbal analogy to be able to derive clarity from one and clear up the ambiguity in the other. So therefore, that's the source from which we learn that the Megillah has to be written on parchment and with ink. Okay. Now, moving on to the next Mishnah on Daf Yutes Amud Aleph on 19a. Here we have to bear in mind what we learned right at the beginning of the tractate, that there are different dates that one reads the Megillah. Okay, you have the 14th and the 15th, which are the basic dates. Those people living in walled towns from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, they read it on the 15th. And those people who lived in unwalled cities, right, in Eretz Yisrael or out in the diaspora, they read it on the 14th. They read it on the 14th. Okay, that's fine. So now we mentioned about people who live in villages, right, where they didn't have what's called Asara Batlanim. They didn't have the 10 people who sit idle in the synagogue to be able to make up a minyan or to deal with communal matters, right? If they didn't have that, then there was a special dispensation made for them that if it wasn't a Monday or Thursday when they would be going to town anyway, yes, then they could read the Megillah earlier. They could read the Megillah on 2 days earlier. You could read the Megillah, let's say on the 11th or the 12th, right? You didn't have to read it on the 14th. So this Mishnah comes along and asks the following question: what happens, right? Well, let's see, right? Right now, at the beginning of the Mishnah, we're just dealing with somebody who lives in a walled city or in an unwalled and goes to, somebody who lives in an unwalled city and goes to a walled city, right? So somebody who lives in a town that's not walled and he walks into a walled city, or vice versa, somebody who lives in a walled city and he goes to an unwalled city. So now, what's going on? What's going on is Purim's come, and let's say you live in Yerushalayim and you decided to go to Tel Aviv on the 14th day of Adar, right? The night of the 14th. The night of the 14th. So you're there at night. The question is, do I need to now go to the synagogue, join everybody else, and hear the Megillah? Or do I say, hey, I'm not from this town. I'm going to be reading the Megillah tomorrow night in Jerusalem because that's where I live. So do I become like a resident of the place that I am right now? Or do I remain a resident of Jerusalem and I'm going to just read it tomorrow night? So the Gemara tells us, the Mishnah tells us, that if the guy has in mind to go back to the place of his residence, then he reads together with everybody else of the place of his residence, like in Jerusalem, meaning the following night. But if not, then he reads together with them, right? He reads together with them, which means to say, if I'm not planning to get back to Yerushalayim before the morning, right, I'm going to have to read together with everybody else on the night of the 14th, even though I'm from Jerusalem. So now the Mishnah says, right?
Rabbi,
Yes.
is that similar to whether a person's holding by one day of Yontif or 2 days of Yontif?
No, that's not so simple. That's not so simple. That's more complicated. The question of 1 day or 2 days Yontif depends on a number of factors. One of them is where the rest of your family is. There are a few factors, and this is a question that you really need to ask a rabbi when you decide to travel. There are some people, when they go to Eretz Yisrael, even though they're traveling there and they're visiting there, they will keep 2 days because they are not residents of Eretz Yisrael. And even though they're not planning to go back before the end of Yom Tif, nevertheless, they'll still keep 2 days. And some people are of the opinion that since I now here in Eretz Yisrael, this becomes my residence for now, and I am going to follow the custom of Eretz Yisrael. Contact your local Orthodox rabbi for a ruling of how you should behave. But here, with the concept of Megillah, it's a little bit different.
So I asked Rabbi Marlowe, and he said to me, do you want to keep 1 day or 2 days? He said, because you can, he said that there are Chabad rabbis that will go with whatever you want to do. So if you're looking for a rabbi so you can do 2 days, I can direct you to that rabbi. If you want to do 1 day, I could direct you to that rabbi. But there are legit,
yeah, so like I said, correct. There are two opinions, and both of them have support for their position. But here, with regards to the Megillah, it's a different ballgame. Here we're talking about whether there's an obligation on you as a person, right, based on where you're sleeping tonight, right? Are you going to be sleeping overnight here in the unwalled city, or do you plan to get back to your place of residence before the morning? In which case, you will then just read it with the people of your town on the 14th by night, on the 15th.
It's not based on where your family is.
David, your system is making noise.
Yeah, that's correct. That is correct. Okay, so let's move on to the second part of the Mishnah. The second part of the Mishnah says, from which point in the Megillah do we read in order to fulfill your obligation? Do you have to read the whole thing or not? So we have different opinions. Rabbi Meir says you got to read the whole thing. Rabbi Yehuda says you got to just read from the second chapter where it talks about Mordechai. Ish Yehudi Haya b'Shushan Abira. There was a Jewish man in the capital of Shushan. Rabbi Yossi says that you read from Achar Hadvar Ma'ela, which is the place where it starts to talk about how Haman was raised up and exalted among all the other ministers, from all the other ministers, right? So that's a three-way dispute with regards to that. We'll bring a fourth opinion later on. Okay, so now trying to take apart the Mishnah. Now, although I filled you in with some details of the Mishnah with regards to when the person has to be going back to the place of his residence, right? The Mishnah itself doesn't say. The Mishnah itself just says a guy who comes from a walled city and then he goes into a walled city, right? So all it says is if he's planning to go back to his place, then he'll read with them. If he's not, then he reads together with everybody else. So the Rava comes along and says that this whole ruling was only taught in the case where the guy who comes from a walled city is going to return to his city during the night of the 14th, right? That's what I explained. Although the Mishnah hadn't said so, this is how the Gemara explains the Mishnah, that it's talking about that you're going to go back to your place of residence on the night of the 14th. But if all you're going to, if the guy is not going to return during the night of the 14th, then meaning to say he will still be in that town at daybreak, then he's got to read together with the rest of the city, right, and read with them at night on the night of the 14th. And where do we know this from? So Rava says that there's an interesting anomaly in the Megillah, which seems to be out of place. It says something twice. It says, for this reason, or therefore, the Jews of the unwalled places who dwell in unwalled towns. Now, what does that mean, right? It's already said, the Jews of the unwalled cities, right? Why do you have to say that who dwell in the unwalled towns? That's coming to teach me that somebody who is in an unwalled place only for one day becomes a resident of that unwalled city, which means to say, once you're staying overnight, you become a resident of that city in terms of your obligation to read the Megillah. So now he says you found a case in the Megillah where it says that somebody who is from a walled city, who comes to an unwalled city, if he stays there for a day, he's going to become a resident of that city, and therefore we're saying that his responsibility is to read the Megillah on that night with everybody else of that city. But how do we know the same in the reverse, right? The Gemara answers, it's a svara. It's a reasonable assumption that if it's true in one way, it's going to be true in the other way. If it's true for the person who comes from a walled city, that if he spends the night in the unwalled city, he becomes a resident of that place and has to follow their practice. It makes logical sense to say that the same is true in the reverse. If somebody from an unwalled city goes to Jerusalem, for example, and he spends the night there, he's going to have to read on the 15th because he becomes a resident of that place. Okay. So far, so good? Okay. Now, Rava right, discusses a different case where you have not a guy from an unwalled city, but rather you have a guy from the village who we gave them permission to come and read it earlier. So here you have a guy who has permission to read it before the 14th, because let's say it's not, Purim is not on a regular Thursday, right? So this guy can bring it earlier. He can read it 2 days earlier, but then he happens to be in
Exact finder apartment.
One second. He happens to be in a in an unwalled city on the day of Purim. So now the question is, what's his obligation? He's already heard the Megillah. He heard it 2 days ago, right? We gave him permission to hear the Megillah 2 days ago. But now he happens to be in town. Does he have to go and hear the Megillah again, or is he done? So Rava says he's got to hear it again. Well, I don't understand. What's the difference between the guy who comes from the village, right, and he stays, and he happens to be in town, right? He happens to be in this unwalled city on Purim, and the guy who comes from Yerushalayim, and we say to him, well, it depends. Here we're not saying it depends at all. Here we're saying if you happen to be in town on the night that they're reading the Megillah, you've got to read the Megillah even if you already heard it. What's the difference? So he says it's very simple. The difference is that the guy who comes from Yerushalayim, the time that he is obligated to hear the Megillah is on the 15th, and that never changes. Whenever he's in the city, the walled city, he has to hear it on the 15th, right? When he comes and he takes up residence, at least for a day, right? Meaning he stays over the night till the morning, then he all of a sudden has a new status as a resident of this town, and now he becomes obligated to read it on the 14th. But the guy from the village, he has always been obligated to read it on the 14th. Why? Because that's what it says we should do in the Megillah. In the Megillah, it says we should read it on the 14th. The fact that we give him an exemption is only because he's not going to be in a place where they're going to be reading the Megillah on the 14th. But once he is in a place where they're reading the Megillah on the 14th, he has an obligation just like everybody else. And so his earlier hearing of the Megillah doesn't count to absolve him from the obligation that he has that came together with the day that of the 14th. Does that make sense? The fact that it's the 14th means that you are now obligated to hear the Megillah. If you are not in a place where they're reading the Megillah, you had a dispensation, an exemption to come and hear it a few days earlier. But now that you're in town, the obligation still stands, and you have to go and hear the Megillah in town. Okay. So now, Abaya challenges Rava's ruling, and he says as follows. He says that the Brisa says that if a person who lives in a walled city, right, goes to an unwalled town, right, it says over there that in either case he will remain right. He reads the Megillah on the same day as those in his regular place of residence. Okay? Now, the Gemara, what he's going to do right now is basically say that this Brisa standalone is problematic in the version that it presents, because it doesn't seem to fit with what we've said earlier. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to amend it. We're going to have to amend it to not be talking about somebody who comes from a walled city, but rather it's going to have to be not Ben Krach, but Ben Kfar, which means a villager, right? So let's understand over here, right? Abaya is putting forth a brisa, which he's first going to clarify and show that it needs to be amended, and it should not read a person that comes from a walled city, but it should be a person who comes from a village. And the ruling is that that he can read in the same time as the people of his place read. that would seem to fly in the face of what Rava says, that if you happen to be on the 14th in a place where they're reading on the 14th, then you have to read with them, and it's not enough to read with the people of your town. So let's go through this bit by bit. First, Abaya clarifies the brisa that he mentioned. You cannot say that this is an accurate rendition, an accurate version of the brisa, because the halacha doesn't fit. Because if a guy, right, is going to, because in the case of a guy who lives in a walled city, visits a town, the law is dependent on whether or not he will return before the morning. So therefore, what do you have to say? That this is not a ruling about the guy who comes from the walled city. It's got to be a ruling about something else. And what's that other thing? It's going to have to be the ruling of a villager who comes to visit a unwalled city. And what's the ruling of the brisa? The ruling of the brisa is he reads it on the same day as people in his regular place read the Megillah, which would be he can read it early. So the Gemara answers, one second. If you, Abaya, already are going to the trouble of amending this brisa that's been quoted, right? Then why don't you amend it to read in a way that works with the ruling of Rava and not against the ruling of Rava? In other words, once you're saying that there's a mistake in the brisa, well, maybe there are two mistakes in the brisa. So instead of reading it as somebody who's come from a walled city, you're going to say it's somebody who came from a village. And instead of saying that the halacha is that you read it together with those people from where you live, read it as not Kaira bim Kaimai, but Kaira imahem. He reads together with those people in the village, and then it would fit with the ruling of Rava. But once you change it so much, I'm not sure why you need the brisa altogether, because you literally left nothing to this brisa. But be that as it may, that's how the Gemara answers Abaya's challenge and says, once you're amending it, amend it to fit with the ruling of Rava. You know, kind of don't ruffle feathers. Rava's ruling seems to be sound with the other clear brisas and the clear mishnayos that we have. Here you've presented one which is not clear and which seems to have problems anyway. So if it already has problems, then just amend it, then it should be no problems at all. Okay, so moving on. Now we come to the next section of the Mishnah, where the Mishnah asks, where do you have to start reading the Megillah from in order to fulfill your obligation? You have to start from the beginning. You start from the second chapter, the third chapter. So he says like this. There's a brisa. And this brisa, what it does is it fills in the discussion from the Mishnah. In other words, the Mishnah just reviews, excuse me, the Mishnah just brings down the actual rulings of these different peoples. But there's no real discussion about it. The brisa brings down more of a discussion. He says like this. Reb Shimon ben Yochai said that one starts reading from Balayla Hahu, right? What does that mean? That means we've got a fourth opinion where you start reading from. You start reading from Balayla Hahu, which is chapter 6. In our Mishnah, it said chapter 1 in the beginning. It says chapter 2, and it says from Ish Yehudi, and chapter 3 from the part where Achar Advar Me'ela, where Haman is promoted. We quote from a brisa that Reb Shimon ben Yochai says that it's from Balayla Hahu. That's when when Achashverosh couldn't sleep, and he asked to have the chronicles brought to him to be read. So now we're going to bring proof for each one of these views. So Rabbi Yechanan says every single one of these four opinions, the four rabbis, they take one verse and they all claim that it's this verse that they're expounding for their position. What is it? What is the verse? It's the verse that says that the Queen Esther and Mordechai, they wrote all the acts of power, right? Eskol Toikef, all the acts of power. So now, what does it mean when it talks about the acts of power? Whose power? So, the one who says you start from the beginning, he says it's talking about the power of Achashverosh. Where does the Megillah start talking about the power of Achashverosh? Right at the beginning, where it says that he was the king over 127 towns, right, or provinces. And the one who says that no, we start from the second chapter where it talks about Mordechai. He says when it says that they wrote all the acts of power, it's talking about the power of Mordechai. And where does it start talking about Mordechai? The second chapter. And the one who says you start from the third chapter, he interprets the verse to mean that it refers to the power, the acts of power of Haman. And where does that begin? That begins in chapter 3. And now, the one who says that you start from the 6th chapter, he says it's not talking about the acts of power of any individual, but rather it's talking about the acts of the powers of the miracle of Purim. And where does that start? Where does the miracle really start to unfold? It's in the beginning of chapter 6, when Achashverosh is not able to sleep, right? His sleep is interrupted. So now, the Gemara brings alternative views.
Rabbi,
Yeah, yes.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
They keep telling you different places where you start reading the Megillah.
Yeah.
But what do you mean by that? Don't you start from the beginning of the Megillah?
Well, that's the halacha. But there's a dispute among the rabbis. Before the halacha was established, the rabbis had a dispute. Some were of the opinion that, yes, the whole book of Esther is from the beginning until the end. But how much of it do you have to read in order to be able to publicize the miracle and to fulfill the mitzvah of reading the Megillah? So some people were of the opinion you don't have to read the whole thing, right? You just have to read the parts that are applicable to fulfill the obligation to publicize the miracle. And where does that start from? Well, each one used the verse in the Megillah that says that they wrote as called Taikev, right? To tell me that the part that we need to read is where it starts to talk about the power of someone. According to the person who says we have to read the whole Megillah, it's talking about that, the power of Achashverosh. The one who says that we have to read from the second chapter says it's talking about the power of Mordechai. The one that says that you have to read from the third chapter is saying it's from the power of Haman. And the final opinion is that we read it from the 6th chapter. He was of the opinion that you start from the power of the miracle. But you're right. We do read the whole Megillah today because that's the way the rabbis resolve the matter. And that's
I see that was before the halacha. Okay.
Yes, correct. So now, although we've quoted one verse where they learned it from, Rav Huna says actually they use a different scripture to determine it. Okay, what's that? They say it says in the Megillah Omaro al Kacha. Omaro al Kacha means for what reason did they see fit to act in this way, and what happened to them as a result. Now, you can understand this and interpret this in 4 different ways. The one who says that you got to read the entire Megillah, the question that's being asked in this verse is, what did Achashverosh see that he decided to now use the vessels of the temple, right? In other words, if you remember from the earlier Gemara, he saw the calculation that he believed that his predecessors had made a mistake about, and he felt that he saw the calculation and that the 70 years were up, and that caused him to feel comfortable to use the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash. And you know what happened? That's what the pasuk continues. What happened as a result? Well, what happened as a result is that Vashti was killed because he went and he used the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash. Vashti was killed. Right? The one who says that we start from Ish Yehudi, so what he interprets the verse of what did, for what reason did he see fit to act in this way? What happened as a result? It's asking on Mordechai. Why did Mordechai provoke Haman? Right? He says the reason why he provoked Haman is because Haman turned himself into an Avodah Zarah, an object of worship. And what happened to Mordechai as a result? What happened to Mordechai as a result is that there was the whole miracle. Because Mordechai stood strong and he refused to bow down to Haman, That's why Hashem brought about a miracle. The one who says that we start from Achar Hadvar Me'ele, he is basing it on the same verse, and he's saying the question is, what did Haman see that caused him to be provoked against all the Jewish people? Right? He says he saw that Mordechai wouldn't bow, and that's why he was aroused against the Jewish people to make a decree to annihilate them. What happened to him as a result? Well, what happened to him? Him and his children were hung. And the final opinion, the one who says that you start from Balaylahu, right? The question is, what was it that caused Achashverosh to bring the Chronicles to be read to him? So the answer is, he saw that Esther was inviting Haman to the party, and he started to think, what's all this about? Why is he inviting Haman? Why is she inviting Haman? So if you remember the discussion from the Gemara earlier, right, we had this whole thing that he said to himself, it could be that people are plotting to kill me. He said, but then why would somebody come along and tell me that I'm being plotted against? Because, you know, when there's a plot on somebody's life, there's usually more than one person involved in the plot. So, you know, people have friends, and somebody should have come and told me. The fact that nobody told me is perhaps this is because somebody's upset with me. Why are they upset with me? Because maybe somebody did a favor for me and I never repaid them, and now they're upset with me. So that's why he asked for the Chronicles to be brought. What happened as a result? What happened as a result is that there was a miracle and the Jewish people were saved as
Rabbi?
Yes.
I have a question. This may be deviating a little bit, but you know, when Shaul, when the Amalekite king was killed, and he found a way to inseminate, you know, he had an offspring, and then of course Haman is the product of that, and then Haman's, when he was hung, and his offspring, this was supposed to have eradicated the Amalekites. Is this my understanding? Because how did the Amalekites continue following that?
No. Haman was not the only descendant of Amalek. And not just that. Haman, if you remember from the Gemara, there's a dispute about how many children he had. Some say he had over 70 children. Some say even more. He had like 208 children, whatever it was, right? Or 214 children, or whatever. He had a lot of children, right? So the Gemara elsewhere tells us, right, that Haman had descendants who were teachers of children, teaching Torah to children in Bnei Brak, right? So obviously Amalek wasn't completely eradicated just because Haman was killed. Haman was a descendant of Amalek, and by killing him, we were fulfilling part of the obligation to wipe out Amalek, but Amalek was not completely wiped out. Okay? He was just one of the descendants from Amalek that was killed, but he wasn't completely wiped out. Okay? So now, how do we resolve this four-way dispute? So Reb Chelboy says in the name of Reb Chama Baguria, in the name of Rav, that the halacha goes in accordance with the one who says that we read the entire Megillah from the beginning until the end. However, he adds and he says that even according to the one who says that we start later, like in the second chapter, right? Nevertheless, Rav says that even according to him, when you're reading the Megillah, right, you cannot have a Megillah that starts from the pasuk Ish Yehudi. You need to have a Megillah that starts from Vayihi B'Machashverosh to fulfill your obligation. Now, obviously, we don't rule that way. We rule that you have to read from the beginning. But what Reb Chelboy says in the name of Rav is that even that opinion agrees that the whole Megillah has to be written, even if you're reading from there. And now, once we already mentioned Reb Chelboy saying something in the name of Rav, right? It tells us that the Megillah is called a book, and it's also called a letter. Why is it called a book? And that's to tell me that if it's sewn with linen thread, it's invalid. Just like a Sefer Torah, right? The Sefer Torah that is sewn with linen threads, it's not kosher. so too a Megillah that's made with linen thread, it's not kosher, and it's called a letter. You tell me that if he stitched it with 3 strands of sinew, then it is valid. Whereas a Torah, right, has to be stitched along the entire connection, right, except for a small area at the top. Whereas when you talk about the Megillah, it's okay if it's only 3 places, but so long as Rav Nachman says that it has to be trisected, which means you have to split up the page, right, and then you have a third of the way down you do 1 stitch and then another stitch and then another stitch, right, in a way that it's been divided into 3 parts. And we'll stop over here. I want to wish you all a wonderful Shabbos, and Emir Hashem will continue on Sunday.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No problem.
After the recording stops, can you stay on for a minute?
Sure.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.